Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the psychology of prejudice. We're going to explore why our brains are so quick to put people into boxes, how those boxes end up building the world around us, and, what the real tangible costs of all that are.
So, let's just start with a question, and be honest with yourself. Have you ever made a snap judgment about someone before you really got to know them? Of course you have. We all do. It seems to be a deeply human thing. But the real questions are, where does that impulse come from, and what does it actually set in motion?
To really get to the bottom of that, we have to zoom out, way out. We need to look at the very blueprint of human societies. It turns out, the way we structure ourselves as a group is a huge piece of this puzzle.
Social psychologists actually have a term for this blueprint. It's called social dominance theory. And the core idea is pretty straightforward. Almost every human society we've ever seen naturally organize itself into group-based hierarchies. Some groups end up with more power, higher status, and more stuff than other groups.
Now get this, these hierarchies don't just happen by accident. They're actively held in place. This happens on a few different levels. You've got individual discrimination, so one person's prejudice choice. Then there's institutional discrimination, the rules, laws, and systems that favor one group over another. And there are even these subtle behavioral things, like who we tend to listen to more in a meeting, that constantly reinforce who's on top.
So you might be asking, well, why don't people challenge these structures more often? A big part of the answer lies in some very powerful, very common beliefs. One of the biggest is the just world hypothesis. It's this deep-seated belief that, fundamentally, the world is fair, that people get what they deserve. And if you believe that, it becomes a lot easier to see inequality not as a problem we need to fix, but just as the natural order of things.
Okay, so that's the big picture, societal blueprint. But let's zoom back in a bit. How do our actual brains navigate this complicated, hierarchical world? I mean, we can't possibly analyze every single person we meet from scratch. So we rely on mental shortcuts. And one of the most important shortcuts is explained by something called the stereotype content model. The idea is that when we encounter someone from another group, our brain almost instantly judges them on two key dimensions. First, are they warm? Are they friendly? Do they have good intentions towards us? And second, are they competent? Are they capable? Can they act on those intentions?
And this is where it gets really, really interesting. This chart, sometimes called a bias map, actually plots different social groups into 4 quadrants based on those 2 simple judgments. And here's the kicker. Depending on which quadrant a group lands in, our brain triggers a very specific and very predictable emotional response.
So, check this out. A group that's seen as high in competence but low in warmth, like the rich, for example, that often sparks envy. A group seen as high in warmth but low in competence, like the elderly, tends to get pity. If a group is high on both, like the middle class is often perceived to be, they get admiration. And if a group is seen as low on both, well, that often leads to contempt. You see? Our stereotypes aren't just random. They follow a clear, predictable pattern.
So we all have these maps in our heads. But what happens when those maps start to dictate real-world outcomes? This is where we see how these abstract ideas and feelings become very, very concrete realities, especially when they get baked into our institutions.
All right, to see this in action, let's look at some data. First up, this chart just shows the basic demographic makeup of the US population. This is our baseline, okay? Just kind of lock these percentages in your mind for a second.
Now here's a chart of drug users. What do you notice? The percentages are really, really similar to the general population. This tells us a crucial fact. The act of using drugs happens pretty proportionally across these different racial groups. But watch what happens when we shift from who uses drugs to who gets arrested for drug offenses. Whoa, the picture changes completely. The percentage for Black individuals just about doubles. A massive disparity suddenly appears, right at the point of policing and enforcement.
And finally, look at what happens when we get to federal prison sentences for those very offenses. The numbers shift yet again, and the result is it's dramatic. This series of charts is a brilliant, if sobering, illustration of how institutional processes can take a behavior that starts out as proportional and produce wildly different outcomes for different groups of people.
So we've seen the big societal data. But let's ask a different question now. What does it actually feel like to live on the receiving end of these stereotypes day in and day out? Let's zoom all the way in now, from society to the individual's inner world.
Imagine living with this question constantly hanging over your head. Did I not get that job because I wasn't qualified, or was it because of how they see me? This is the essence of something researchers call attributional ambiguity. For people in marginalized groups, it's often impossible to know for sure if what happens to them is because of their own merits or because of prejudice. And that uncertainty is absolutely exhausting.
And that constant ambiguity fuels another really powerful psychological effect called stereotype threat. Now, the important thing to understand here is it's not about whether you personally believe a negative stereotype is true. It's the fear that you might accidentally do something that confirms that stereotype in someone else's mind. This classic experiment shows it perfectly. When women were given a challenging math test and told it was just a problem-solving task, they performed right on par with men. But when a different group of women was given the exact same test but told it was a test known to show gender differences in math ability, look what happened. Their scores plummeted. The simple fear of confirming a stereotype was enough to actually impair their performance. It's incredible.
And what about for people who feel like they have to hide a fundamental part of who they are to avoid prejudice? Maybe it's their sexual orientation, their background, their religion. The cost is just immense. We're talking about real, measurable cardiovascular stress, a constant drain on your cognitive resources, and the psychological burden of developing what's called a divided self.
Okay, for our final piece of the puzzle, let's zoom back out one last time. We've seen the societal structure and the personal toll. But what is the collective price that we all pay for living in a world shaped by prejudice?
This question really just hits the nail on the head. Think about it. All of the lost potential, the creativity that gets stifled, the brilliant ideas that never see the light of day because someone was judged by a label instead of by their merit. That is the prejudice tax, and it's a tax that everyone in society ends up paying.
One of the most tangible costs of this tax is, of course, economic inequality. But what's really fascinating, and maybe a little concerning, is that our perception of how much progress we've made on this front might be completely, totally wrong.
Just take a look at this chart. Honestly, it's staggering. That top line shows what people perceive the progress on the racial wealth gap has been. We think things have gotten dramatically better, right? But that bottom line, that's the harsh reality. The actual gap has barely budged in over 50 years. There is a massive chasm between what we think is happening and what the data actually shows. And that really leaves us with one final big question. If our perceptions can be so far removed from reality, what does it actually take to see the world and each other more clearly? From the giant hierarchies that structure our world, down to the split-second judgments inside our own heads, prejudice is a powerful, complicated force. But understanding how it works, how it's built, how it's maintained, how it feels, and how we misperceive it, well, that has to be the first, most essential step toward reducing the heavy tax it places on every single one of us.